Hello, welcome to Game Dev London. I'm Chris Payne, and with me is Peter. I did not check with Peter
We
how
checked the
to
spellings
pronounce his
before, but we
surname.
didn't get the pronunciation. It's Peter Ejazcik.
Peter Ijazchik. Is that right?
Yep, letter E, the word jazz, the word chick.
Okay, that's great. You can find Peter at on Twitter at Peter Triple Z, which is much easier to say. So apologies for that, Peter.
Oh, I'm completely used to it now.
Peter is an animator in games, so I wanted to have a chat about some of the fun technical things that games bring up that are interesting. So first off, how did you get into doing animation? Is it something you were always interested in, or?
I've I've never had a direct route into where I am now, so I always have to think a bit about it. But I think you asked me this beforehand, and so I've been thinking back, and I believe it's due to when YouTube was first in its first couple of years, there was a spree of stop motion Lego animation, and that was what originally got me into animating. Because I thought, hang on, wait, I have a Lego. I have a bad camera somewhere in the house, which I can then take pictures of and create stop motion animations, which is still on YouTube. No one can find them, which is thankful for me. And ever
That's
since
great.
then, I've then continued kind of passion into animation, which then stretched into university, where I did the games animation course in Teesside University, and then from there, I moved into. Well, I didn't. I was in games animation at Teesside, and I moved to games animation as a job.
Marvelous. So, just to give people some context, what are some of the things that you've worked on that they might have heard of?
Uh, the only one which is officially out and people have heard of is the Radical Forge game Brightpaw, where I was
Hmm.
the animator, rigger, and implementer of all the animations in that game.
That's great. I've not played it, but I'm aware of it.
Available now on most consoles
Yes,
and mobile.
that's one in which you play a cat looking for
Yes,
your missing owners, if I remember
yes,
correctly.
yeah.
That's cool. So in terms of just also full disclosure, Peter has done some unannounced work with me on a project, which is how we know each other. Um, but obviously, we can't talk about the unannounced stuff. Frustratingly, um,
Oh, it's been so long, and I can't wait to tell people about it.
yeah, same here. Um, but animation is a fascinating one. It's uh, really like the core of an awful lot of games. How did you find moving from doing like stop motion Lego animation into doing animation for games? What did you find were the main sort of like differences between those adjacent forms of animation?
I think it might have been the lack of restrictions because with Lego, you were very much limited to this is the physical body of a character and this is the physical environments. Whereas when you get into games and 3D animation on computer, you are the options are just expand to they expand so much because you can characters have unlimited possibilities. They could be a normal stout creature, and then you could just stretch them up into something that's 200 feet tall, and then you have to animate that. And I think that was the biggest one, but it's also the main thing in games animations I found is most of the games animations I've worked on are lots of looping animations, which you don't necessarily work on with stop motion animation. With stop motion animation, you have the scene and that's about it. But with games, you then have to go this one animation. It's about 2 seconds long, but you're gonna have to watch it again and again and again, but also from every angle as well. So you have to make sure it looks good from every different angle, which you don't have to do with stop motion.
That's an interesting one as well because I'm
Mm.
aware that for animating for TV and film, there's sometimes you can cheat shots by sort of like stretching the rig
Yeah,
more than it really could ought to in order
yeah,
to like make like things look like they are working correctly. Um,
Which you can do in games as well. Overwatch does that in a ton with their first-person animations. Well, I think it specifically an example off the top of my head is the Mercy Idol rig. All her fingers are meant to curve around her staff. Hang on, I've got to dice here, but they don't curve around. The fingers actually, instead of the joints being there, the joints over here, so you can see them from above. And so if you see the hand positions without the items they're holding, the fingers are completely broken.
that's really interesting. So yeah, I guess there are certain animations in games that like
Mm,
holding weapons from in a first person game that
mm,
are only seen from one angle and have to
yeah.
look right there. So yeah, that's an interesting consideration. What about I mean, I don't know if you've worked on a fully sort of like photoreal motion captured title, but that's a very different style again compared to
Mm.
a more cartoony squash stretch
Yeah,
style.
I have worked on some motion capture work, and it is, yeah, it is very different. You are very much at that point limited by human motion, but if you're going for motion capture, that's what you're hopefully aiming for. You're aiming for a more realistic motion, which you then fix and patch up in software like Maya.
So when you're working on animations for a character, you've talked about looping
Mhm.
animations being an unusual thing. Is it difficult to come up with motions that don't look obviously repetitive for idols and such like?
Yeah, I think that's most of once you've got down the timing of a motion, the rest of the work is entirely making sure it doesn't look like it's looping on a loop. So often you'll just have multiple layers where on some layers you have arms going it so if a looping animation is over 60 frames, you then repeat that 3 times. So you have 180 frames, and then another layer of animation. You add some arm movement or some sort of asynchronous movement, which isn't in time with the looping. So you have 3 loops of the walk, but you only have 1 loop of like an arm twitching slightly. So it adds. So when you see
Oh,
them together, it looks like it's 3 different types of loops which you and because it's by the time you get to the end of the third loop, you don't realize it has looped. If that makes sense.
right. Yeah, that's clever and
Mm.
complicated.
It's a it's a lot of like everything in games. It's complicated until you spend some time in it, and then it's going, oh yeah, I can do that in 5 minutes. It's all good.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's one that I've not come across before, which is interesting. Um, so when you're doing an animation like that, how is it limiting to create sort of like short and looping animations, or are you? Is it easy to convey sort of like the personality of the character that you're animating with those restrictions?
That is, yeah, that's one another really hard part of animating within a loop is getting across the character of animation, the character within the animation. I think a great example of experimenting with this was Big Hero 6. They have 6 different characters, and to identify their movements, they did 6 different bouncing ball movements so that they could reference how the ball bounces to implement that movement into that idol. So it might be you'd you really have to think about how a character moves. So would it be fast? Would it be slow? Would it be bouncy? Would it be asymmetrical? So they'd be slow and fast. You really have to think about how the character would work, but then you have to limit yourself again by how it needs to work in game because most games, if you're playing them, every character moves at the exact same speeds,
Hmm.
and so you can't really have. It's rare that you have 2 playable characters. One of them is slower. You're gonna want them to be the same speed so they can do the same actions, and so it is it's an art form, not one which I think I've gotten my grip on yet, but it's coming along.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess you're limited to like if they've got different length legs, then you can have the
Mm.
like they can have a different stride.
Yeah,
Um,
100% exactly. They can be
and
a lot more lanky with their movements, a lot more sweeping if they've got longer legs. They
yeah,
don't have to be in as much of a rush. It's like watching a big dog versus watching like a chihuahua walk. They go in the exact same speeds, but the chihuahua's legs are going 200 times a minute, where a large dog just does one sweep of their legs and they've done the same speeds.
yeah. And I suppose you can still use sort of like more flowing movements for one character versus
Mm.
staccato moves for a different
Yes.
character. Do you find that you're able to pick a kind of like a signature style for a particular game and stick to it, or do you need to like you try to use all of the tools? I'm just thinking of
Yeah.
very flowing animation versus staccato animation. Like, quite often that would
Mm.
like some sort of like shows or games
Mm.
pick one of those and lean into that specific animation style for all of their characters.
I think it 100% depends on what game you're making.
Hmm.
As most of the games I've worked on, the animations have kind of they haven't needed to be as fast and snappy as other games. So you have more time to let the characters move and flow and be more naturalistic. Whereas games like Elden Ring, which everyone's talking about still, it's a very snappy game. You need the animation to react immediately. So you need to make sure that the actual movements don't all the animations need to be snappy in some sense so that when a character quickly changes to a role, it doesn't look off-putting that they're going from a sweeping movement to a sharp movement.
Hmm. That's a that's an interesting one because that you raise that because
Mm.
that is obviously critical for the player character that they react quickly to user input, so the
Mm.
user feels like they're the character is obeying them. Um, but for the bosses and enemies in Elden Ring, their animations are much more about telegraphing attacks, so that
Yeah.
the player can once they've learned what that character's behaviors are, they can see an attack coming and
Yes.
dodge it if they're quick enough. I am not.
Yeah. The animators and designers at From Software are they are magicians in the way that they can create so many different characters and create so many different motions, which they can then convey just not maybe not the first time, but convey with just a simple enough movement that your brain can go, oh wait, this is one that specific movement, so you can then react to it. They are incredible.
That does sound really challenging to be able to
Mm.
animate something that the player can recognize the attack from the first quarter second of movement. That's
Yeah.
yeah, that's hard. And then to um, do that for a half dozen different attacks for one character, and then for 100 different characters.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you would you? I mean, I don't know if you've played it a lot. Have you spotted any kind of like patterns where, like for example, that they have a particular um, language for sort of like if it's going to be a sweeping attack, do they kind of like pull back behind their shoulder in preparation or something? Is there anything consistent across characters?
I haven't played it at all. I've
Ah,
100% just watched streams of it, so it's only been very specifically whatever the streamer or YouTube video has been looking at that point. So I haven't had enough
yeah,
to look at stuff overall.
that's fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, Elden Ring is a fascinating example because it's got such at times grotesque characters. Have games given you some like opportunities to do some like really interesting animation rather than just sort of walk cycles and
I think
movement?
uh, my history of games is still fairly limited with a lot compared to other animators, and so a lot of my references will go back to me animating on Brightpaw, and so one of my favorites is animating non-human characters, which Brightpaw allowed me to do. One of our characters in there is called Daz, and they are robots, and they are one of the best characters in the entire game. And so it's trying to convey human emotions through effectively of human emotions onto a box with a lifter. those are some
Oh
of the
wow.
fun animations to do because you trying to work out how can a character just moving around and lifting and lowering a lifter, how can I convey
Yeah.
emotion through that?
It's like
Those are some of the best animations I find.
it's like going back to the Pixar lamp, isn't
Exactly.
it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's
Those that early Pixar work where they're experimenting with stuff like the lamp and the early Toy Story characters,
hmm
where a lot of the early Pixar stuff was just people of different sizes, and then they start experimenting with characters like Slink, the
yeah.
dog, where it's a yeah those yeah
Yeah, it's quite fun to see, like interesting, especially in Toy Story. It's particularly interesting to see them try to turn sort of like things like a speak and spell into a character and have it kind of like doing its like rigid
yeah
waddle, um,
yeah
uh, and obviously there's fun with toys that come apart and so on. Yeah, I mean that must have been a dream for an animator having so much variety to experiment with.
mm,
Um, Although I imagine the tools were pretty crude at the time.
yeah. I can't imagine what they would have to go through at that point in time to get what they got.
Yeah. So on that subject, let's turn to tools a bit. You talked about before about having like very few limits in terms of what you can actually do with a character. Do you find that I mean I don't know what your preference for tools pipeline is. I guess it depends on who you're working with. But
Yeah, my preferences have no matter on what I do. I
yeah.
use whatever my employer is telling me to use.
I mean, how much of your animation skills translate across different applications? Because obviously, like, to going from stop motion to animating on a computer is very different in the way that you pose the character. Um, so, do you find does it take you very long to get used to a new user interface if you had to switch?
It doesn't take that long. Once you know a 3D software, whether it be Max, Maya, Blender, or any other 3D software, once you know one, most of them tend to go by around the same general rules. So it
Mm-hmm.
takes you some time, but switching from something like Maya Max to Maya, that's maybe a week or so. And again, if a job you're going to requires you to change software, they're usually okay with you taking a week or so just to learn the software.
Yeah. Um, and do you do your own rigging and
Yeah,
and rig tools?
yeah. Most of the work I've been on, I've either been the sole animator or one of a very limited bunch of animators. So I've had to learn the entire process from rigging that character from skeleton to skinning it to animating it to then exporting it and implementing it in engine for a lot of the time. So
Wow.
a lot of the work I've done is me thinking of three locations at once, going, okay, so I'm
Yeah.
rigging this, so then that's going to affect how the animation works, but then I have to think about how it's then going to be implemented in engine. And then when I'm in animating, I need to go, okay, what can I improve next time when I'm rigging it, and how are the movements I'm going to do affect how it's been implemented in engine, and so back and forth between all of them.
Yeah. I mean, I happen to know that from work that we've done together that like that has allowed you to do some clever stuff with
Mm.
creating a kind of like an intermediate rig that you could use as the um, to do the primary animation on,
Yes.
and then to get the bold movement, and then
Mm.
do sort of like clean up fixes on the character's proper rig, so that you can quite quickly transfer the same animation onto multiple characters. Um, I mean, have you found? Obviously, like you're pretty proficient with building rig tools uh, for that sort of remapping, but you know, do you make a lot of use of rig tools for things like foot rocking and sort of like facial, like separating facial controls from the actual face?
Well, foot rocking is something I implement into rigs definitely.
Mm,
That is just such a useful tool I find
yeah,
that limiting, especially when a foot is about 3 to 4 joints sometimes, and if you're trying to have them tiptoe, if you don't have that
yeah,
the uh the the foot controls in there already, you're going to just be adding more animation time as you're having to match up the rotation of the foot to the rotation of the toe joint, and then having to edit the height so it then doesn't just float through the ground as you're doing it. So that's something which I think is almost 100% necessary when you're rigging. What was it? And the other one was facial animation.
yeah. Well, I mentioned that because I have seen a lot of character rigs that have a little sort of like face diagram floating next to the character,
Oh yeah.
so that animators can like waggle those controls and then
Hmm.
and see the results on the face rather than actually trying to grab the face and move it.
Yeah, that all goes down to I think personal preference of the rigger. Some people like to have lots of all the controls on the face, so you'll have about 5 to 50 controls of circles just over the eyebrows and over the mouth and over the nose. And then some
Wow.
animators will have it so that it's just 5 controls, and then there's sub controls within those sub controls. And so it's always fun to experiment going back and forth between the two, finding out which one you work with best, or depending on how the rig is set up, what is the best one version for that rig.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, facial animation is well, I presume it's the most complicated um, uh, flavor
Yeah,
of animation. But
yeah, it's
it's
a whole animation study in itself. I think there's a couple
yeah,
companies in the UK who just specifically do facial animation.
yeah. So I mean, can you switch between those like two modes if you've so I'm imagining if you wanted to have a very simplistic rig, then you would prepare certain facial expressions so that you could sort of like use the rig to ramp the weights of those, or sort of like certain like mouth shapes or eye um, widenesses, and have those things pre-prepared. Um, Whereas if you want the example you were describing with a lot of like facial controls, sounds like you might just be sort of like just grabbing like one corner of the eyelid and get that to twitch on its own. Is it easy to switch between those two modes, or do you have to pick one to at the beginning?
I think with all animation, it's just finding out which type of animation you're doing and
Mm,
getting your grips onto it. So it's less likely that you'll be switching between those two within the same project. So the time it
right.
takes to acclimatize to the different rig setup will be the time which you just spend to acclimatize to the rig in general as you're working on a new project.
Right.
So there won't be as much of a need to specifically know or learn both at the same time.
Yeah. I guess
Mm.
it comes down to styles because
Mm.
I know when my daughter was young, there and I watched a lot of CBeebies. There were certain shows. There's a show called Pocoyo, which was had a very distinctive animation style that was very sort of like staccato, key poses, barely any tweening, um, and
Oh, was it Pocoyo?
yes, yeah,
That's a great show.
it's fantastic. It's very funny,
Yeah.
but I really admired the animation style because
Mm.
it was very spare, and it was all
Yeah.
about just those key poses,
Mm.
and you know that there was not that very little kind of like flow between like one pose and the next. And do you think that that would have obviously it was primarily a stylistic choice, but do you think
Mhm.
would it have been a
But
time
in a
saver
way,
to
it's
pick
also
that?
a time-saving choice as well,
Yeah,
because it's very pose to pose, and so when you specifically focus on pose to pose animation, it reduces the amount of time and effort you have to put on the tweening to actually make sure it's
right.
smooth and the movement from pose to pose looks natural. So if you specifically focus on a pose to pose fast style of movement, it looks a lot quicker, and you also have an automatic style to it.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. The other one that is springing to mind is Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, which has a very
Yeah.
Very sort of like bendy, flexible
Mhm.
style that, but they mix like sort of like very fast actions with very kind of like slow
Mhm.
movements as well, depending on the context,
Yes.
and that works remarkably well. Um,
Yeah, they a lot of those. I think it's the same team who are working on the the Adam Sandler vampire animated movies, which the name is escaping my head at this exact
oh,
moment.
Hotel Transylvania.
I believe it's the same team, and both of those are based off books, if not. And so they really were emphasizing the look of the books and the shapes of the characters that were shown in the books into the actual 3D animation, which is one of the reasons why we have such wonderful stylized animations in those movies.
Cool. So I'm just going to jump back a little bit because when we were talking about foot rocking, it prompted me to think about another like feature of games, which is inverse kinematics. So, uh, how do you find inverse kinematics an easy thing to work with? Because obviously it depends on the game, doesn't it? Certain characters require IK to get the foot placement right, but if the game's cartoony enough, then it just doesn't matter. Um,
Yes, that's very true. I would love. The thing is, I specifically work in 3D animation in games, so I haven't
mm,
had as much time to work on 2D or look at as much as 2D games like stuff like Cupheads or some pixel
yeah.
games. So 3D animation is very specifically an IK heavy game. So you don't, off the top of my head, I can't think of many super cartoony 3D games where that wouldn't apply as much.
Well, I can toss you one
Oh
example
yes,
that
please. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I worked on, which was the Lego games.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Because they've got such kind of like stumpy legs and giant
Yeah.
square feet. It's very limiting.
Yeah.
You can't really do very much with those without completely ruining the pose.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I asked because there's a lot of technology now to sort of like facilitate things like feet matching the floor, which obviously is
Mm.
more of a thing for a like high end photorealistic game like The
Mm.
Last of Us, and so on. But do you find that uh, do you work with IK a lot, or do you just sort of like have to like just hand it over and hope that like the programmers don't trash it too much when they put all of that stuff on?
Uh, well, to go back a little bit as well, when you first brought this up, I was originally thinking about the IK in the rigs because
Oh, of course,
primarily
yes.
that's the primarily where I spend time with IK is actually animating with inverse kinematics in the rigs. So if you have a character animating a character holding something, you're not going to manually edit the arm. You're going to edit
Yes.
where the hand will be, and then the rest of the arm follows.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so I haven't had as again because again my games had the work I've done on games so far has been limited to more games like Brightpaw, where you haven't needed as much of a need for IK. I think
Mm.
the most common use of IK at the moment is mostly it's split between foot height. So if you're walking up a stairs, you have one leg higher, but that and so that would be entirely done in engine. Or if a character is holding something or is goes to reach for something, then you have the character character extend their arm in engine towards the targets. But it's that's one of the things where, as an animator, you can animate it and then hand it to a designer who is implementing all these aspects and then hope it works. Or, or again,
Yeah.
it's my preferred version. If it is possible, is hand it over to and make sure you maintain contact with them so you know what they're wanting to do,
Yeah.
and so that when they say something's not working, you can already think of either a solve or a reason why it's not working, so you can then help them out in
Right.
fixing it.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. So, for example, gonna have to be vague, but like
Yeah.
we recently collaborated on something where you had a character with a scarf, and
Yep.
we'd talked about how to do the scarf, and I'd suggested that I could just shove some physics on it,
Yep.
and we would have some nice secondary motion. And I finally got that working, and it does look great.
Yeah.
Because it's a simple thing that it just needs to swing a little bit, and it looks really nice when that swing carries across animation transitions, and
Exactly. Yeah.
it just feels natural. So yeah, that's
Yeah,
cool.
material physics in games are a bit of a godsend, especially to maintaining movement between animations. So you can have
Yeah,
two animations which may not loop and merge as well as you like, but because you have the material animation consistently moving between the two, it just creates the look and the illusion that it's one animation, that it's not splitting between the two. It's fantastic.
yeah. Um, is that more of an issue with games? Do you think because games tend to stitch a character's movement together from because of the interactivity?
Mm.
It tends to be a series of independent animations that have to sort of like cross blend from one to the other.
Yeah.
Whereas someone at Pixar could, fully sort of like blend the entire thing and uh, make it very sort of like smooth and flowing.
Yeah, that's in movies have the advantage that everything they do is all rendered in one batch, so there's never going to be any random animation that they
Mm,
won't know about. They're going to animate it, then they're going to apply the material physics to it. Then they go, does it look good or not? If not, they edit the physics slightly, then re-render it and see if that works. Or as games, every character animation where the player has control, every animation is effectively random. You never 100% know when a character is going to do a specific movement because the
yeah,
player wants them to do this or that, and so you have to be very you have a lot of limitations on how you can then apply the material physics in engine because of this random input from the player.
yeah. I feel that I have worked on a game where the main character wore a skirt, and trying to make the physics for the skirt work without draining the entire CPU was
Yeah.
really hard. And without we did in the end have to compromise on the design of the skirt to make it less of a tube because it created so many problems, and just like treating it as a couple of like flaps of like rectangular cloth basically,
Yeah.
because allowing it to break that way just solves so many problems. Um,
Yeah, it's especially it is a hard thing to do with full body materials
mm,
like skirts because they go around the entire body, can have multiple points of interaction with the body, so
yeah,
the potential movements just go to an exponential amount.
yeah. It was
Yeah.
in this particular case. The challenge was it looked great when she was walking, and as soon as she broke into a run, then the skirt would just sort of like uh, glitch around and then sort of like pop off to one side of her
Yeah.
hips or something. It was just it looked very bad. Um, but yeah, that's at some point I'm going to have to go back to that problem and solve it properly. But
Yeah.
cool. So oh, I had another follow up question that was related to IK.
Mhm.
Um, uh, yes, because I'm a programmer, so with IK, I'm obviously thinking about the runtime side of things.
Yes.
Um, when the I imagine those like IK tools are quite helpful for getting um, I those sort of animations where you need to like pick something up or sort of like make contact with a specific point.
Mhm.
Um, obviously gets a lot easier. Uh, do you have to do an awful lot of that in video games? Because I know from in certainly in my games, I will try do as much as I can at the design stage to try to avoid characters having to interact directly with things because it's
Yeah.
so damn hard.
interaction of objects in animation is incredibly hard. It's
Mm,
for, especially in games where it is different objects, and so you have to. Yeah, but it's also something which you see throughout all mediums of animation.
mm,
Because I finally got around to watching the stop motion Netflix movie The House, and there's one scene at the beginning where someone's eating something, and as an animator, anyone else watching, oh, he's just eating stuff. As an animator, I'm going, they're showing this guy from the back, so you don't specifically see him picking up the food and putting it in his mouth, avoiding the problems of animating interacting with another object.
yeah,
And then you get that in games where you actually have in engine two different objects, and so you have a whole plethora of different options of how you're then going to implement it. So it could
yeah,
be like on your side where it's going, okay, I'm just going to do this all through coding so I can see how this works. Or you do it through entirely animation where you'll have both the characters in the animation software, so you have the character and the objects, and you have to manually edit and animate how the objects move. So when you export the object, you just have a floating object, which you then have to merge in engine, or you could do something in between where you animate the character in the software, and then you import them into the game engine, and then you program in an IK thing, so IK like snaps, so the object clicks to the character's animation, and so
yeah.
if that, so yeah,
Oh,
there's numerous ways of trying to figure it out.
yeah. I mean, it's that complexity that leads to things like Mario and Link just sort of like holding up empty hands with for an object to float above them.
The amount of times I've used Animal Crossing as animation references on like short stubby characters I've worked on in other games, where it's just a character going like "da da,"
Yeah,
and it's just floating in front of them, and it's just such a simple, effective tool for showing.
it,
Uh,
it's
yeah.
great that you can get away with that stuff
Mm.
for cartoons. Like on the flip side, however, I've got to mention stuff like The Last of Us 2. I remember watching the trailer for
Yeah.
that and seeing it. It's funny because like movie trailers, it's all sort of like, look, I made like, wow, big things blowing up or collapsing. You know, like entire cities getting sort of like reduced to rubble is very impressive. And then in video games, it's like that character just took a jumper off on camera.
There was a whole conversation after that game came out. I was going, how did they animate it? Was it all in engine? Did they pre-render it? And I think it was that they
They
pre-animated
must,
it in a software
yeah.
and then baked that animation out and then played it in games because it was entirely a cutscene scene, so it
Yeah.
wasn't you didn't
So
need it to be
it
interactable.
must have been modelled with physics and then
Mhm.
exported in Alembic and just played
Yes.
back. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. That
But
that's
then you have the ropes in Last of Us, which that is
oh,
entirely physics animated in game, which
yeah.
the
That's
programming skills required to do that are just incredible.
I will
There's
say
also
I've
just yeah, yeah.
yeah. Sorry, Peter. I've not seen the ropes in Last of Us 2, but the ropes in Uncharted 4, like from the
Mm,
Jeep winch, that was amazing. The
yeah.
attention to I am sure that like some poor programmer must have spent a good couple of months just
Oh,
working.
everyone's a bit lucky.
Yeah, just working on the rope physics there because you can pull it away from the car. You're holding
Mhm,
onto the end of the rope. You can turn around and he passes it behind his
mhm.
back so it doesn't get tangled around him. And then you can walk around a tree and it actually like goes around it like a pulley. It's like
Yeah.
the most amazing, and it's only used I think 4 or 5 times in the game. Um,
Which is crazy when you think about game productions going, they did this just for one scene.
I know. It's like how much effort for. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really impressive. I don't know if it's quite as impressive to someone who's not like um, working in the industry and doesn't quite appreciate how much work it is. But it feels completely natural. So I
Yeah.
guess that's the win is that when you can just sort of like, okay, how do I attach the winch to the tree? Well, I just grab it and I take it around the tree and then I hook it back
Yeah.
onto the rope. That's what you do in real life.
It's the magic of video games is that it's all misdirection. It's us the makers trying to make the players think something which looks simple enough. It looks simple, which is incredibly complicated in game. to make it work. It's just
Yeah.
tricking them into thinking looking that it's easy, but it's actually incredibly hard to do.
That actually that reminds me of another like stellar example
Mm.
of animation where they chose not to hide anything, which was Arcane. Um, uh, I don't know if you've watched that, Peter.
One of many things on the list of
You
things I need to
have to
see.
watch that.
Yeah.
The animation is absolutely outstanding, and they don't cheat anything. There are characters picking up kind of like a floppy object from a surface and like scooping their fingers underneath it and lifting it, and it flops around their fingers as they pick it up, and like stuff like that
Yeah.
I'm not even an animator, but I'm watching it and going sort of like, whoa, I would have cut away from that.
Yeah. As an animator, you then go on to the how did they do this mindset? It's like was it entirely physics based? So did they just animate them picking it up and then hope and then apply the physics afterwards and hope it worked, or is there some sort of like small rig inside the object so that they can manually update most of how the object moves and then apply physics over it so you still have most of the control, or were they incredibly crazy and it's all of the object is hand animated? It's one of those things which they could have done it in numerous different ways. It's
Yeah,
incredible.
I mean, Arcane is well worth a look.
Mm.
Actually,
Yeah.
you'll in particular you'll find it interesting because all of the characters are beautifully smoothly animated, but the backgrounds and the models themselves have a very painterly textured
Yes.
style, and then all of the visual effects like fire and smoke, those appear to be hand painted on twos instead of on ones like the rest of the characters.
We are
Uh,
living in a golden age of animation at the moment. Ever since since Spider-Verse came out, we've just had a
oh
plethora of
yes,
just incredibly animated, creative, artistic animations. And because it's shown through stuff like Spider-Verse that makes money, studios are throwing money at stuff like that. Like you can see after however long it's been in production, the new Cat in Boots movie
mm,
trailer. That looks incredible. It's a mix of smooth to step animation and like Arcane, it's got the painterly artistic feel to it. And so we are in an incredible time for animation.
that's that feels like like a really good note to end on. Just one final question
Yes.
then. In terms of animation, because we've got such great tools and technology for creating animation now. What are you particularly excited about looking forward? Like maybe a particular game or a particular technology that you want to use, or uh,
Oh, I'm so far behind on all of that. I'm like 5 years at least behind on games I need to play that I own and haven't played yet. Um, I think I'm just excited for any game I get to play at this point, let alone things I get to. I think I'm going to leave on Puss in Boots. I'm excited to see how the animation works and has been implemented in that movie. I'll say that.
that would be interesting to look. I'm going to go and check out the trailer and
Highly recommend it.
see.
It
Yeah,
looks incredible.
fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Peter. And
Oh, it's been
yes,
it's been
if
great.
you enjoyed listening to us nerd out about animation, then please pop along to gamedev.london where you can find links to the rest of our podcasts and our Discord community where people are chatting about all manner of game technologies in there. Until next time, thanks very much.